Good morning, my dear brothers and sisters. How are you? Good seeing you again. Good to be back. Good seeing that we have a lot of people now in the church and we've got altar servers now. These boys are back to altar serving. Thank you for being here. Our gospel today, often titled as the multiplication of loaves and fish or the feeding of the multitude, is one I would say very important event in the life of the early church. In fact, it is so important that it has been recorded in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No other miraculous event other than the resurrection has been given with this emphasis. It is also interesting to note that we actually have 6 versions of this story. We have one each in Luke and John, and we have 2 versions recorded by Matthew and Mark. One is titled The Feeding of the 5,000, and the other version is entitled The Feeding of the 4,000. We call this in theology doublet. You've got variations, or if I may use a popular term now, variant, in details, but they are essentially the same. Thus, they are called doublet. Jesus multiplied loaves and fish, and he fed the hungry crowd. Today, what we have is John's account of the event. So, what is very distinct in John's account? Well, first, it is good to note that John does not call this event a miracle. Although it is truly miraculous, and I believe John thinks it is, that Jesus multiplies loaves and fish. But John actually prefers the word sign, or semeion in Greek. And the role of a sign is to point the reader or the listener to a deeper reality or a higher truth. When you see, for example, a signpost this way to Sacramento, that is not yet Sacramento. That is only a sign that points you to where Sacramento is. When you go to a restaurant, for example, you ask for the menu. The menu is not yet the food. You don't eat the menu. But the menu tells you what food you can have in that restaurant. So the menu somehow plays a kind of a sign to point you to what kind of food you can order in that restaurant. So the sign is not the reality itself. The sign is not the destination itself. A sign's role is to point you, to lead you to a higher truth or to an even greater reality. And so it is important that we go beyond the sign so that we can discover the truth or the reality. So what does John wants us to see in this sign called the multiplication of loaves and fish? Let me point out to you some of them today. First, we see that this event is read against the background, or must be read against the background of our first reading today from the second book of Kings. There was a man who brought to Elisha, the man of God, 20 barley loaves. And Elisha asked this man to give them away for people to eat, for 100 men to eat. Note, 100 men. This servant objected that it was not enough, to which Elisha said, just give it to them. Well, guess what? When they had eaten, everybody had their fill, and there was even some left over. So why is this juxtaposed in our gospel reading today? Because this tells us that there is someone greater than Elisha here. Contrast 20 barley loaves against this gospel's 2 barley loaves. Contrast 100 men being fed versus 5,000 men, not including women and children. This tells us that there is someone greater than Elisha here. Yes, Elisha is a man of God, but Jesus is greater than Elisha. Secondly, when Jesus saw the large hungry crowd, and after ascertaining what they had on hand, Jesus said to his disciples, "Have the people recline." Recline is in between lying down and sitting down. And the gospel says, and I quote, "Now there was a great deal of grass in that place," which was expected because that place was beside the Sea of Galilee and it was still springtime then. So, naturally, there was a great deal of grass in that place. But this detail also makes us remember the very famous Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In green pastures, He makes me lie down. In green pastures, He makes me recline." So John here portrays Jesus as the good shepherd. He provides for his people. In fact, he does not only provide them for them what they need, he provides for them abundantly. "My cup overflows," Psalm 23 says, which means that God is a God of overflow, of abundance. And third, we realize that among the gospel writers, it is only John who does not have an institution narrative. That event when Jesus had his Last Supper with his disciples and he took bread and wine, thereby instituting the sacrament of the Eucharist. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have that, but John doesn't. But it does not mean that John wasn't interested in that, because he has our gospel today. And in the story of the multiplication of loaves and fish, we hear what also Jesus does in the Eucharist. The gospel says, Jesus took the loaves. What did he do? He gave thanks and he distributed them to the people who were there. And we hear this over and over again in the Eucharist, during the Eucharistic prayer, recalling Jesus' Last Supper. At the time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. So yes, John may have no Last Supper narrative, but he has the gospel today. He has the feeding of the multitude. And it is meant for us to be a signpost that points to us what Jesus does every time we celebrate the Eucharist. He feeds us. He feeds his people, and he feeds them with the bread of life. But there's one detail that I find very, very surprising and remarkable or interesting in John's account. It is John alone who tells us that the loaves were made not of wheat, but it was made of barley. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. You know, in biblical times, barley was much more widely cultivated. It was valued less than a wheat, and it was the main food of the poor, of those who had nothing or those who had that much. But when it was fully given to Christ and freely offered to Christ, those loaves made of barley became a remarkable source for Christ to feed his people and to feed them abundantly. How often, my friends, do we feel that we only have a barley? That what we have is not as sophisticated or not as valued as what others can give? How often do we think that we've got nothing to contribute? That we are only poor? that we've got nothing to bring to the table? How often do we think that we're not as phenomenal in the works of evangelization as Bishop Barron, for example, or Scott Hahn, or Mother Angelica, or the saints who were intellectual and spiritual giants, and they have done great works? And so most often we say, let them do the work. And oftentimes we use that as an excuse not even to contribute to the church and to the ministries in the church. But remember, that barley, darling, even though it was insignificant and valued much less, when they were freely and given fully to Christ, that barley did phenomenal things. That barley can do phenomenal things. It can feed people. It can bring them so much joy. It can satisfy a hungry heart. It can lead others to Christ. So, never underestimate a barley. Never, ever underestimate your barley. What's important is that it isn't possessed. It isn't called mine. What's important is that it is freely offered, given, and shared. There was this rich lady who lived on her own and led an impeccable life as far as the externals of religion were concerned. She went to Mass daily and found little or nothing to confess when she went to confession. Eventually, she died, and to her horror and surprise, found that she had been assigned to hell. So she complained bitterly, explaining how she had lived a virtuous and utterly blameless life on earth. Satan inquired of Peter and was told that there was no mistake. But Peter conceded that if she could think of one single act of kindness, heaven would be open to her. So the woman returned, saying, "One day," she said, "as I was cooking the dinner, a beggar came to the back door. He was hungry, and so what did I do? I gave him an onion." Peter checked and found that it was true and said to Satan, "So now we are going to lower the onion into your department at the end of a rope. Tell her to clasp it, and then we'll pull her up here." So needless to say that the woman grabbed the onion, and suddenly her feet left the nether region. And as she was being pulled up, some of her companions, seeing the opportunity of getting out with her, clung to her. Let go," she shrieked, kicking out at them, saying, "That's my onion." With these words, "That's my onion," the rope snapped, and she fell back with her onion into the arms of Satan. Friends, whatever is from heaven, no matter how minuscule they may be, or you might think they are, like a barley, or even like an onion, they are not meant to be possessed. They are not meant to be called mine. They are meant to be offered, to be given, to be shared. You'll be surprised. They are enough to save you and even others. Amen.